Welcome everyone to English 3E. This is class 5 for Unit 1, and I am Jillian Percy. As always, here is my contact info. I am at the office from 9 to 12 and then from 1 to 4. The studio, if you want to call in and talk to me while I'm actually taping, then that is 1-800-465-7144. If you're trying to reach me during the office hours to talk about homework, 1-800-667-3703, or if you're in town, 737-1488. You can also fax your work to WASA at any time, 1-800-463-7852. And my email is jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. You can send a message to me and I will be able to get back to you. Facebook and YouTube are both the same name, capital G, capital P, ERCY space capital WAHSA. If I'm not in the office, don't leave a message because right now we're having a bit of trouble retrieving my messages and I may not get it. Okay, so only call and talk to me directly. I had a question the other day about the rubric and the marking scheme. So I kind of put together one here to talk to you about. Somebody was concerned that they had to get every single thing right, and I was just pointing out you absolutely do not need to get everything right in order to pass this course. You only need to get 50% of it right. In other words, half of it right, and you pass the course. So here's an example of a rubric I might use while I was marking one of your writings. This wouldn't be like one of those small questions that are only worth 2. This would be if I was looking at like a rough copy or a good copy of something. Demonstrates an understanding of text format and features. D would be a limited understanding, C would be some understanding, B would be usually, and A would be consistently. Can identify the main idea and supporting details in the text. A few details, can sometimes find the details, often, almost always. Can state an opinion about the text or characters with supporting evidence from the text. That's the key part of this one. If you only have limited evidence, that's a D. Some supporting evidence, that's a C. Generally, a fair bit of evidence, B. Consistently or with a great deal of evidence, that's an A. Can utilize reading strategies to increase understanding of the text. Sometimes assignment may ask you to use a specific reading strategy, and that will be part of the assignment. So if that happens, with a limited level of skill is a D, sometimes they can do it, or somewhat you can do it, is a C. You can usually demonstrate that strategy, that's a B, or with a high level of skill is an A. This one I included because there's a lot of reflection assignments. Can reflect on personal literacy and learning skills and suggest goals or strategies for improvement. Occasionally, sometimes, generally, and consistently. So if, for example, I had an assignment from you and I thought, okay, well, they're usually showing me an understanding of the text. They can generally identify the main idea. They can provide some supporting evidence. And they can utilize sometimes reading strategies, but they're pretty good at reflecting on personal literacy. Okay, so some of this is a B, some of this is a C. There's a little bit more of the B. I probably would be leaning to something like a B minus or possibly a C plus for this. It would depend a little bit on the essay, but this is just to give you an example of a marking scheme. Okay, this is just a rough assignment. It's not attached to any specific assignment, but just to give you an idea of how I would be marking something. Okay, yesterday we did quite a bit of work yesterday, so please don't skip class 4 if you're going through this on your own. We analyzed poetry and compared how poetry differs from prose. We examined the text features and the format of poetry. We learned the text features of a play or a script. We examined ways to increase our expression as we read by using punctuation marks and making connections to the emotions that characters might be feeling. We worked on visualizing the background and actions of the characters from the play. We used the stage directions to help us build a picture of the characters from the description, and we completed any assignments related to reading poetry and reading plays. If you have not done that, probably it would be a good idea to pause the recording, get those assignments finished before you move on. There's not really a lot of point in moving ahead and just listening, because it's going to be overwhelming and you won't really remember what gets said anyways. Okay, I did want to cover a little bit of grammar each day because there is a lot to learn about grammar, and it is one of those things that can really trip up your writing and make it sound a little bit funny. Often we speak far more fluently in any language than we do with our writing. Okay, sometimes there's something about transferring our thoughts from oral to written that can make it just a little bit more of a challenge. So I wanted to kind of discuss grammar a little bit. It also gives us a common vocabulary. So if I'm making comments about something about grammar in your writing, you know what I'm referring to, which you wouldn't if we haven't discussed this a little bit. Some people may feel like, why does grammar even matter? It's boring. Yeah, it is a little bit boring, but every language has rules that help us convey what we mean. But each language has slightly different rules, and we often understand these rules instinctively when we speak because we're hearing it literally from the time that we are tiny babies. But we may have trouble putting the rules into words when we try to put our thoughts into writing. It's almost like you can always walk, but trying to explain to somebody how to walk is a whole other thing. When we don't follow these rules, though, we may find our writing doesn't sound quite right, or it may even not communicate what we were trying to communicate. For example, in English, we would say the dog bit the boy. If we say the boy bit the dog, it would mean something completely different. But why? It's all the same words, right? It's just different order. So how does that matter? Well, because in English, the rule is that the noun or the pronoun that comes before the verb is the subject, and it is the one doing the verb. So in the first sentence, the dog is doing the biting, but in the second sentence, the boy is doing the biting. But in some languages, the position of the noun wouldn't matter. It could go in front, it could go behind, it wouldn't matter because the verb would have a little indicator, either a suffix or an affix, that tells you which word is the subject and which one is doing it. So that's just one reason why understanding how the rules of English work can help to make sure that what you are writing is really what you're trying to say. So an adverb. Adverbs can describe or modify a verb. They can also modify another adverb or even an adjective. So for example, if it's describing a verb, let me just kind of grab my things here. Ran is your verb, and slowly is telling you how the boy ran. If it's describing another adverb, here's my adverb, right? Dangerous is describing how the person skated, but we're adding this, that it's very dangerously done. Okay, we're modifying it, we're making it extra intense there. We can also describe an adjective. So if I were saying my teacher is happy, happy is an adjective, it's describing the teacher. But I can modify it with an adverb and say it's extremely happy. Okay, so those are three main ways that we can use an adverb. Adverbs basically are describing, whether they're describing a noun or an adverb or an adjective, so not a noun, a verb, they can describe how something is done, when something is done, where it is done, how often it is done, and to what extent. So like how thoroughly it is done. An adverb can stand all by itself, could be just like one word, or it can be part of a larger adverb phrase. Where do adverbs show up in the sentence? Because that matters in English. Where something is matters in English. Adverbs can occur just before a verb. So here, my verb is told, and the adverb is coldly. She coldly told him it was over. Adverbs can also occur just after the verb. So here, ran is my verb, and I say the dog ran quickly. Quickly is describing or modifying the word ran. They can also be used at the beginning of a sentence, often set off with a comma. So yesterday is an adverb, and it's describing when they wrecked the car. Yesterday, I wrecked the car. Okay, this is a really common format you're going to see in English. It's a yesterday, or any kind of time or sequence or transition words, it's really common for us to put them at the front of a sentence. Okay, so here are some adverb examples and some adverb phrase examples. Today, I went to my new school. Now it's telling you when he went, but the whole thing's occurring today, so it's just fine to put it in front. The boy jumped quickly. Here's my verb. The boy jumped quickly down from the ladder. The robber carefully disabled the bank alarm. So carefully is describing the verb, but the verb's behind it this time. The robber carefully disabled. I feel like after is probably the most common one you're going to see, but the other two are perfectly acceptable and considered correct. Okay, adverb phrases. Remember, a phrase is a small collection of words that are not a full sentence, right? I couldn't just say during the summer. That's not a sentence by itself, but I can say during the summer, I swam every day, right? During the summer is describing when you swam. Okay. I broke my leg last winter. When did I break it? Last winter. On the weekend, I plan to go fishing. I work out every morning. That's describing when you work out. Here's a long one. As much as he could, Grandpa helped shovel the steps. So as much as he could is describing how he's helping to shovel things. Okay. Those are two examples of how you might see adverbs and adverb phrases in English. We're talking about them because it might be a helpful thing for some of the writing that we're going to be doing. Here are some examples of adverbs. And again, these are the main things that adverbs tell us. When an action happened, where it happened, how it happened, to what extent, and how often. Okay. When, a lot of times people think of when as being like 3:00, and it could be 3:00. You could say at 3:00, but there's all sorts of time words that are not like a clock time, that are relating to days or weeks or months or seasons, right? Like I could say last summer. So here we have things like last year, next month, today, tomorrow, last week, later, soon, now, yesterday, tonight, already, and then. These are really common to see at the beginning of a sentence. They don't have to go there, but it is really common. Telling us where is the action happening? Towards something, there, inside, here, back, far, above, abroad, behind, away, outside, downstairs, nearby, indoor, in, out, elsewhere, and anywhere. How. There are so many verbs that are about how. This is kind of the traditional type of adverb, and it ends in ly. All right, almost any adjective can be turned into an adverb by adding the ly ending. I'm not going to read every single one of these. It's just some examples. There's so many in this category. To what extent? This one's actually a really short category. These are some of the most common ones. Not, so, very, to, quite, rather, somewhat, extremely, really, terribly, and very. Like if I said he was very tired. How tired is he? He's very tired. If I said she was not amused, how amused is she? Not at all. So that's answering to what extent. It's kind of a funny phrase, but that's what they use. How often? And again, these are some examples. They aren't the only ones, but these are the most common ones. Sometimes, never, often, seldom, generally, occasionally, rarely, normally, frequently, hardly ever. So if I could say, I go driving sometimes, or I rarely go driving. Either way, it's describing the driving. Okay, so those are just some examples in case you're looking for adverbs. All right, today's assignments. Today, we are going to work on reading pages 30 to 35 in the textbook. That's the one called Making It Work. And the article is called How to Read Literature. Number 2, activity 2 on page 36. You have to choose a play on page 159, 210, or page 53 to do this assignment with. And then there's a short extra assignment, number 6 on that extra assignment page. Okay, how to read literature. This is probably one of the most crucial articles for this entire course. So please take your time. Make sure you read it, not just look at my summary of it, okay? So how to read literature. This is in pages 30 to 35 in the Making It Work textbook. One way to understand literature is to understand the elements of the story and how they work together. So we are going to look at the elements of narrative. A narrative is simply means it's a story. It could be a short story or a novel or a play or even certain kinds of poems. So the main elements of narrative are characters, setting, plot, conflict, theme, and point of view. Now we're going to go into each one of those a little more carefully, okay? Characters, the people or animals who are the main topic of the story. This would include like aliens, robots, whatever. As long as they're the main ones doing the events, they count as characters. So if a dog is the detective in some sort of cartoon and he's running around doing stuff, he counts as a character. If a novel has a dog that occasionally walks in the room and gets petted, that doesn't count as a character. So whether they're the ones doing stuff is basically the key point. For example, in Guardians of the Galaxy, both the Star-Lord, who's a human, and Rocket Raccoon, who's an animal, are characters. And then I added in Thor, who's an alien god, is also a character. The major character is often called the protagonist. Sometimes he's called the hero if we're doing fantasy stuff. The character who is against the protagonist, like the one who's always kind of in conflict, is called the antagonist. Sometimes he might be called a villain, like especially like in a superhero movie, like a Marvel comic movie or a DC comic movie, like Batman or something. Other times he may simply be an ordinary person who is simply in conflict with the main character. So for example, Loki from the Avengers might be considered a true villain, right? He's actually evil. He's trying to thwart things. However, two men in a love triangle might have one character as the protagonist, that's the hero of the story, and the other man might not be a villain, like he's not a bad guy, but he may definitely be in conflict with the main character. For example, in the movie The Hunger Games, Peeta is one of the protagonists, and the other guy is Gale. Gale's not really a villain, but he definitely is one of the antagonists, and he's in conflict with Peeta. My apologies, should be saying Peeta there. With Peeta over Katniss, right? So those guys are in a conflict with each other. At various times, it causes them to make different choices. I'm using movies because I'm trying to pick movies that we've all kind of seen. Whereas with books, there's so many books, I can't guarantee we've all read the same books. Minor characters have smaller roles, and they often have less influence on the events of the story. All right. Setting. The setting is the place and the time in which the story occurs. Short stories may have only one setting, but a novel might have multiple settings. So would a play. In some stories, the place may occur mostly inside a particular house or a building or a certain town or city. In other stories, the setting might change quite a bit and be a central part of the events of the story. For example, like in a spy novel or a travel story that moves around the world to different countries, right? At that point, the setting may be absolutely crucial. And when the setting changes, all sorts of things may change: the characters, the people, the motivations. Stories can also occur in an imaginary world. That still counts as a place. Stories can occur in the present day, in the future, or in the past. Depending on when the story occurs, it can affect all sorts of elements of the story itself. It might affect clothing, what kind of laws exist, what kind of houses they have, what jobs are available, relationships, personal decisions. So, for example, if you set certain stories at a certain time in the past, women didn't have a vote, right? They weren't allowed to own property. Anything they did as a job, they didn't get to keep the money. The money would have just gone to the guy. Well, that's going to have a significant effect on the story you write if you set your story in that time frame. Stories set in imaginary worlds may also have a sense of being set in the past, like low technology or similar laws to our past. They could be set in the present, similar technology and laws, or the future, advanced technology or extremely different laws. Some stories, such as stories with time travel, might have multiple different time settings, right? Think of things like Doctor Who or that TV show called Travelers or Timeless, right? They may have like a starting base of a certain time, but they constantly are going to different time settings. In an ordinary plain story, the time is not normally going to change, but it definitely can. Plot. Plot is, or all the actions and all the events that happen in any kind of a narrative. Usually it is the conflict that drives the plot. The main character generally finds themselves in a conflict or with a problem that they must solve. And often the character may have to change in order to solve the conflict. The plot usually has four main parts. First, there's the beginning or the opening scene. And at that point, you're usually introduced to the main characters, the setting, and the main conflict. That might be a short opening scene of like 5 minutes in a movie, might be the first chapter in a book. The rising action or the main part of the story. This is a series of events or actions in which the protagonist is wrestling with the conflict. We're going to talk about more about conflict in a moment. There may be obstacles to overcome in order to increase the suspense. This is the main part of the movie or the book. This is the part where they're constantly trying to do something and they're getting thwarted in some way, right? The climax or the crisis is the high point of the narrative. Often the protagonist is making a decision to change, or they take some really important action that finally solves the conflict or the problem. And then the falling action, or what the French call the denouement, the conflict is resolved. There's small points in the plot that are getting wrapped up, and often the protagonist has changed in a significant way, right? This is usually like the last chapter or the last 10 or 15 minutes in movie. This is a smaller section, right? The biggest section is the rising action and the climax. So here is a typical plot chart, okay? Here's the beginning, here's the rising action, there's the climax or kind of the high point of the story, and there's the falling action. And this is just trying to show like the level of suspense or your engagement in the story is low. It starts off, you don't really know anything, you don't really know the people, you're not really very engaged at the story. They have to write it pretty good to get you engaged, but slowly the author's going to keep ramping things up. They're going to introduce more problems. They may introduce more interesting characters. Maybe there's a love interest. Maybe there's a kidnapping, whatever. Things are going to get more and more intense and more interesting until the big solution scene, right? The major chase, the giant fight, the whatever it is that changes everything, basically. And then after that, it doesn't usually like end instantly. That would be an odd movie that did that. There's usually a whole bunch of little tinier moments where they wrap up things with different characters, show how the big event caused problems or solved things. And gradually the suspense and the excitement kind of winds down a little bit, okay? This is a basic plot diagram that you'll see all over the place. And you could discuss just about any major movie, major novel in relationship to this kind of structure, okay? Conflict. Conflict is the struggle that the main character experiences. The struggle could be physical or mental or spiritual or even emotional. Main types of conflict: person versus person. The mental or physical battle between characters. So again, I'm going to use the Avengers just because I think almost everybody's seen it. So the Avengers versus, oh my gosh, my mind went blank on the terrible guy that has the five terrible Infinity Stones. Anyways, the giant battle between those two. That's person versus person. It doesn't have to be one person; it can be multiple people, right? Person versus self. A person who's in conflict with themselves and two opposing sides or desires. So if you saw Oppenheimer this summer, there's various points in time where the main character is trying to decide how he feels about what he's doing. He's creating a nuclear bomb. It's going to change the world forever. Is he doing the right thing? Right? He's really kind of wrestling with that. Person variant versus nature. This is a fight against the natural world, like a fire or tornado. A movie like Twister, right, where the natural elements of the world are what they're fighting against or trying to survive against. Person versus supernatural. A fight against a ghost or a monster. For example, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? She's always out there killing vampires and demons and various different monsters, right? Person versus society, a struggle against society and social issues or social justice issues. I'm having trouble thinking of an exact example right now, but these are all sorts of movies. Often this might be historical movies, right? Where they're talking about some of the civil rights issues in the past, uh, overcoming slavery, winning the right to vote. All those kind of things are like one person or group of people against a problem in society. Okay. Theme. The theme is the message or the moral about human life or human nature that has been conveyed to you through the events and the characters of the story. It's not usually stated outright. They don't usually say, this is the message, but it's implied. You have to kind of read between the lines. It's based on um, all the different decisions the characters made, how they've changed, how things are happy or sad. Different readers and viewers may come away with a slightly different message. Sometimes this may be the result of bias in the book or movie. So, for example, in Finding Nemo, some people might say the message is don't give up. And others might say the message is a father's love can overcome any obstacles to save their child. Um, they're both correct. One's kind of maybe more detailed and specific, but someone who walked away and named either one of those as the main message, they're not wrong, right? They're just having a different point of view. I just wanted to point out theme is not the same thing as topic. The topic of a movie or of a book might be war or sports or school or civil rights, and all those topics could still convey a message of don't give up, or it could convey a message of why bother fighting? You're never going to win, kind of thing. The message is different than the topic. Okay. All right. So all those literary elements are one way that you can examine different types of literature and narrative. But that is not the only way. And the way we're talking about next is kind of more common in modern times. And in some ways, it can be easier for some people. But in other ways, it can be kind of harder because you have to really be willing to think about your connections to the text and the text connections to the world. And it really depends on what you're like as a person and how comfortable you are talking about your own personal experiences and stuff. So sometimes looking at your personal response to a story can be a very powerful tool to understanding literature. A personal response to literature is going to rely very heavily on your ability to make connections between your life and the text. It may include connections based on race or gender or age or country of origin. It may include connections to the major events in the books or in the protagonist's life, such as family death or major illness or disease or persecution and prejudice or social issues. A personal response to literature is a valid way of understanding or analyzing literature. The one point to be aware of is that different people may have very different responses to a text because we've all had different life experiences. So, for example, a story about being diagnosed with cancer is going to be read very differently by a person who's never had cancer compared to someone who's just been diagnosed with cancer. And it might be read differently again by someone who just lost someone to cancer and who's passed away. And all these responses are perfectly valid, but that may be extremely different in what parts they notice or that they like or that they dislike. And it may affect what kind of message they take away from the text. So that's the important to keep in mind is often when discussing the elements of literature, if you read it and I read it, we're going to have a lot of similarity between what we see. But when we're looking at literature through personal response, we may have extremely different responses to the exact same story. So that is one thing to consider when you're doing that. Okay, so here are the steps to analyzing a story through personal response. Now, anytime I'm doing these steps, they sometimes seem so artificial because in real life, you probably wouldn't do each step separately all by itself. They're kind of happening more fluidly in real life. But when we're trying to break down a new skill, this is kind of how we have to talk about it. Okay, so don't let it seem overwhelming. It's just because we're analyzing this idea in a very detailed way so that it makes sense. So step one is read whatever narrative it is for the first time. Write a brief response, including some questions that give your first impression of the story. What did you like? What did you not like? What confused you? And how you felt about the characters, how you felt about the ending or the outcome, and how the conflict or problem was resolved. So that's just kind of your first quick impression, right? Step two, read back your response to yourself and then underline any questions you had about the text to yourself. This is one of the things people sometimes had problems with questions. Sometimes people read books and they really never think of any questions. They're just kind of like, it's like they're listening to somebody talk and they aren't really engaging. Other people are constantly kind of questioning, like, why is he doing that? What's going to happen next? Where are they going? And they're constantly kind of thinking, and it's almost like they're having a conversation with the text. That's the kind of questions they're talking about here. And if those don't come naturally to you, that's fine. You may find as we go along that they become more natural to you. Step three, read the text again. Keep in mind that the questions that you asked and look for some of the answers to that question. But also keep in mind some of the possible questions I'm going to mention on the next page to think about as you're rereading. So because we know not everybody has those kind of questions in their mind, nothing wrong with that, just not how some people approach books. We've given you kind of a list of questions that you can think about if other questions didn't cross your mind, okay? So, how is the protagonist like or unlike myself? Or how is the protagonist like someone I know? How is the conflict like or similar to one I've experienced? Who else do I know who has experienced this conflict? How did I solve this problem when I had it? How would I have solved this problem if it happened to me? This is a big one. And sometimes people are like, well, I can't understand this book because I never had that problem. I'm a guy, I'm not a girl, and this whole book is about a girl. Well, what if you were, right? How would you approach this? It's okay to imagine yourself as a different person or having had very different experiences and to try and understand a story that way. How did the protagonist change in the story? It's really common for the hero to become braver or more wise or more careful or more loving, right? Those are all really common changes that happen in all sorts of stories, whether it's in a book or whether it's on a movie. How would I change if this happened to me? What do you picture would happen? How do you think you'd look at the world differently? How would you interact with people differently if the events in the story had happened to you? What did the events of the story teach the protagonist about life or people? And this is coming at what we talked about theme before as one of the elements. This is where you sometimes can see the theme coming through. What did the events show you? And what did the people themselves show you in their speeches or their actions? And again, what would I identify as the theme of this story? Sometimes it's really obvious and it kind of screams at you through the whole story. Sometimes it's not really as obvious and you got to kind of really dig deep to figure out what is the theme? What's the whole point of this story? What are they getting at? Step four, reread both of your response paragraphs. Highlight what you think are the most important points or your best comments about the story, right? Use these points to write a final paragraph about the meaning of the story. So just want to point out again, as you're writing, not everything we write is going to be amazing, and that's just fine. They're saying, look back at the stuff, pick out the best stuff, and use that to write your final paragraph, right? You don't have to use every single thing we wrote. That's why there's a difference between our rough copy and our good copy. Another point, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I wanted to come back to it again because I think it's a really important point about this course is some questions are going to speak to you or seem easier to write about than others. And that is great. That's awesome. Pick the ones to write about. You won't always have to answer every single question. And after a while, many of these steps or questions become automatic, and you will be asking yourself them internally as you read. Sometimes what I find is as people are looking at a bunch of questions, sometimes they're worried, oh, like that's too easy. The teacher's not going to be impressed if I choose that. Everyone will tackle that one. Don't worry about if everyone tackles that, or don't worry if you think it's easy. If you think it's easy, it may be easy for you, and for someone else, it's completely hard. So don't feel like you have to pick the hardest ones to get good marks. I'm really not looking at how hard the question is. I'm really looking at how your answer is phrased and how you explain things. And that is true whether the question is considered easy or hard. So go ahead and let yourself pick the ones you want. Just going back to here, right? Like, maybe I don't want to answer how would I have solved this problem if it happened to me. I just can't go there. Okay, well then I'm going to look at how did the protagonist change in this story, right? Maybe I don't want to talk about how did the events teach the protagonist. Okay, but maybe I'd be happy to talk about the theme. If we answered all these questions, it would be a very long paragraph. It's okay to pick and choose a little bit which ones really work for you and which ones really don't, okay? Okay, on pages 34 and on pages 35 in Making It Work, there is an excerpt from the first chapter in the novel, and it's followed by the reader's personal response to it. And my suggestion would be read the excerpt first, think about your own ideas about your own response to it, and then take a look at what the other reader wrote. I know when I did that, some of the conclusions or the observations she came to, I didn't agree with, right? And you may find the same thing. Maybe you're going to think, yep, that's all perfect. I agree 100%. Or maybe you're going to think, oh, I feel like she's missing things or misunderstanding things. The other thing is, as you look at her response, you're going to see her response is pretty detailed, but it doesn't necessarily cover every single question on our list. It more covers the important questions or the ones that the reader was able to see connections to in her own life or the lives of others around them. Okay. So today's work is do activity 2 on page 36. To do this, you're going to need to choose a play from page 159, page 210, or page 53. Now, it just says choose a play from the anthology. Read it carefully and then write a personal response to it. I was initially confused and was like flipping through the book that's written in, trying to find any plays, and I clued in later on and was like, oh, this is the book that has all the assignments. The other book, the one called The Road Ahead, that's the one that has the plays in it. Okay. So take a moment to look through the plays. At least read a page or two of each one before you pick which one you're going to want to talk about, right? If you get partway through one and think, oh my gosh, I hate this, or I just don't think I'm gonna have enough to say about this, it's totally fine to pick a new one, right? You could read every single one of them and decide from that way. It's just fine. So whatever one you like out of the textbook. This activity is going to be worth 12 marks, okay? And again, the personal response. So like we just practiced, you're going to look at a personal response. You're going to look at these questions, right? You're going to follow the steps and give us a personal response to that story, okay? You can use the personal response on page 35 to kind of give you a role model of how to do it. Okay. Page 27. Okay, this is also in today's work. Remember at the beginning, there were like 4 pages, and there's one page that is what we call the extra assignment page, okay? And question number 6 says, describe a journey you have made. Where did you go and for how long? Who was with you? What were you doing? Did you have to prepare for this journey? And if so, how? Now, sometimes a journey sounds extra fancy and you feel like it has to be like some amazing trip to Hawaii or Morocco. And it doesn't have to be. It can be any kind of a journey. It could be a journey to Sioux Lookout or a journey to Winnipeg or a journey to a friend's camp line. Any kind of journey is fine for this. It does not have to be any kind of a major trip or expensive a trip. So I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of an example of what I might do. Just I'm trying to kind of keep on writing in front of you just so you can see the process, because sometimes writing is happening in our head. It can be really, really hard to understand what other people are doing. So I'm trying to kind of like make my head into a glass box so you guys can see what I'm doing, to have an understanding of how to do it yourself. That's really what I'm looking for. So I am just going to talk about a journey I took in March. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit first because that can help be my pre-writing activity, right? Thinking about what I did. So my dad was kind of sick and he was having some problems and it came out of nowhere. It was really unexpected. Me and my brothers were all taking turns coming down to visit and take care of him because it went on for a good 6 weeks at least. And we were all having to take time off work and nobody wanted, like, one of us to have to take off just the 6 weeks because, we all have bills to pay. And it kind of had a pretty good ending. Okay, so where did you go and for how long? So oops, nope, don't do that. What's it trying to do? Sorry, I was trying to update there. If you suddenly saw a black box, that was trying to update for some reason. The journey I went